All right, in this lesson, I'll introduce the getLevelValues method, which is actually called on the index of a multi-index data frame in order to extract one of the levels or the layers, more specifically the values within that specific layer. But before I get to this method, I wanted to introduce an alternate syntax that we can use to set a multi-index. In the last lesson, we explored the setIndex method, but there's actually a parameter that we can use on our readCSV method to set that multi-index immediately upon the import of a CSV file. So you may recall from an earlier lesson the index call parameter, which stands for index column. And in the past, what we've been doing is giving it an argument of a string that basically represented one of the columns that we wanted to use as the index of our data frame. So in this Big Mac CSV, we have a date column, for example. And if I provided an argument of date here, it would take that column and move it immediately into the index position. We can see it present right here in bold. Well, as it turns out, the index call parameter can also accept a list of arguments, and that list can be a collection of strings representing the columns that we'd like to stack within our multi-index. So if I replace this string with a list, and let's say I want to keep date as my most outer layer, but immediately after that I want to use my country column as my second level of my multi-index, I can put that, and that's going to import the CSV and then set those two columns as my multi-index. There's one additional thing I wanted to do here that's a best practice technique, which is to call the sortIndex method on my data frame. And I'm also going to pass in that argument of inPlace equals true. Now, with smaller data sets such as this one, you may not see it visibly, but rest assured, whenever you're working with very large data sets, sorting the index greatly enhances the speed and efficiency of basically every method. The algorithm that Pandas relies on in the backend to find what you're looking for is basically much faster if Pandas knows that it's working with a data set or an index that's kind of sorted in sequence. So even if you're working with a small data set, it's a good habit to get to start sorting the index. Now, when it comes to multi-indexes, it's a little bit more complicated because you have different levels and layers, and we have a separate lesson later in this module focused specifically on this method. But for now, the basic sortIndex method here is just going to take both of those levels one by one and then sort them one at a time. So the default ascending parameter is set to true, so it's going to sort the external layer first. The date is going to do that from earliest to latest. Then it's going to move to the country level, and then it's going to sort those ascending equals true as well, which means alphabetical order from A to Z. So now everything within this multi-index data frame is sorted, and operations will be faster down the line. So I'm going to keep this code in any future lessons where I use this import code. This is a best practice to get used to. So let's execute this, and there we have our multi-index data frame. So let's get back to the getLevelValues method. As I mentioned, it's called on the index of a data frame, which in this case is a multi-index object. So how do we access the multi-index object that makes up the index of our data frame? Well, you may recall we have that index attribute on a data frame. And in the past, this would usually just give us an array of the values that made up the multi-index or the regular index. When I execute this, you can see that we're going to get a multi-index object back. So this is a little bit confusing because we're calling an attribute on a data frame, which is returning a piece of information to us. You think it's not actually manipulating anything. But what it's returning to us is a multi-index object, and that object is going to have attributes and methods, and that's what we want to actually call the method getLevelValues on. Remember that at the end of the day, you can think of a data frame as just a collection of pieces, of puzzle pieces that come together to form the whole. So this component of our data frame right here is the multi-index. It's its own separate object in the Pandas kind of technical structure. So when we use the index attribute of a Big Mac, we're basically telling the data frame that we want to pull out this piece, take out that component and show it to us. This piece, we see it visually here, but behind the scenes, it's its own separate object. It's a Pandas multi-index object, and it does have methods like any object does. So now that we know that this is referring to the multi-index that we see right below, we know that we can call things like methods on it. So let's try the getLevelValues method right here and open our parentheses. And this method can accept one of two options. It can either accept a numeric argument or the name of the level within our multi-index. So just like with everything else in Pandas, the levels or layers in a multi-index get a numeric ordering sequence. So the most outer layer, which in our case is date, is going to start counting at 0, and then country, which is the second one in line, gets an index position of 1. So if we write a value of 0 in here, that's referencing the date level or layer of my multi-index. And if I execute that, you'll see that it's going to extract the datetime index object. That's its own separate object, by the way. And this is the object that makes up this level or this layer of my multi-index. So you can see the first date here is January 1st, 2010. And here's that date as well as all the other times it occurs per country listed right here. Predictably, if I write in something like 1, that's my second index in line, which is country. So when I execute this, I'm going to get an index object from pandas that's basically a list of all of the countries listed in that column. Keep in mind, you may get the impression that this is deduped because it's starting at Argentina and ending at Vietnam, but it is actually including all of the values within this country layer. So because everything is first grouped by date, it's going to go to Argentina, then loop to the end of the alphabet for that date, then move on to the next date. So it's just a coincidence that we have it starting at A here and concluding towards the end of the alphabet. Most of these countries, I'm guessing, are going to be present more than once as we move throughout this level or layer. So it's not deduped, it's just the entire values of the index pulled out. So as I mentioned, we can pass this method a numeric argument of the index position of the level within my multi-index, or I could simply give it the name of that layer. So for example, let me just go back to 0, which is our datetime index. Instead of this code, I can just copy it and replace my 0 with date, which is the name given to my outer layer here. And when I execute this, you'll see that the results are exactly the same. Nothing has changed. Similarly, I'm just going to copy this entire thing and put it down here. Let me comment this out. This 1 right here is going to extract the second layer of my multi-index, which is my country. And similarly, if I comment this out and replace this date with country, which is the name of that layer, there we're going to get the exact same results. They're identical. So when might you want to use the numerics? Predictably, whenever you don't have a name for this level or layer. There's no real other way to extract it besides specifying the position. Or similarly, if you have perhaps multiple indexes with the same name, you may specify which one you mean that way. So basically stick with numeric whenever you can't have a verbal way of describing what it is that you want to pull out. Generally, I prefer, of course, this second approach because I think it's much more user-friendly, but either one works. So that's the getLevelValues method. Remember, it's called on the multi-index object, which is a component of our data frame, so we have to extract it with that .index attribute. And the method itself takes either a numeric argument or a string argument representing the name of the level or layer. And finally, as a final review, we also introduced the index call parameter of the readCSV method, which you can feed a list of strings representing the columns that you want to comprise the multi-index that will be formed upon the data frame once it is imported. So that's the getLevelValues method.